What if the gods never left? Not the kind that sit idle in the heavens, content with prayers and hymns. No. These were architects, engineers of flesh and fate, builders of worlds who did not merely watch, but created. One among them stood apart. Enki. The trickster. The whisperer of forbidden knowledge. The god who shaped humanity, not as a gift, but as a necessity. A design. But something went wrong. The flood was no accident. The first extinction was no mere off. The gods erased something. Buried it. Drowned the past in silt and silence. And yet, the echoes remain, on clay tablets that survived against all odds, on ancient stones whispering of a truth too dangerous to name. Sumer, the first great civilization, was not a beginning. It was a reconstruction. A reset. Enki defied the will of his own kind. He crafted man from clay and blood, infused them with intellect, with spirit, with rebellion. He was the architect of life and the saboteur of its destruction. He saw what was coming, the purge, the cleansing, the rewriting of history, and he planted something in the human soul that could never be erased. A flaw. A weapon. A key. The gods tried to bury him. They rewrote his name, twisted his image, transformed him into something else. Enki became Ea, Ea became a whisper. The whisper became silence. But silence never lasts. What was hidden is resurfacing. The ancient texts breathe with unearthed truths. The fragments piece themselves together. The code within our oldest stories is cracking, revealing something far older than myth, something alive. Enki did not just create us. He left us something. And if you think the story is over, you're already too late. The air is thick with heat, the kind that clings to the skin and burrows into the lungs. The river groans under the weight of time, its waters sluggish, ancient, pulsing with something older than memory. Shadows stretch across the land, long, thin fingers reaching out from towering structures of mud brick, their foundations drinking the blood of 1,000 lifetimes. This is no ordinary place. This is where the first cities rose, where civilization itself was wrenched from the chaos of the wild. The ground beneath is sacred, not because of gods, but because of what was built upon it, what was birthed from it. Sumer. The name itself hums like a half-forgotten incantation, a whisper from a time before records, before stories were caged in ink and clay. These streets, if they can be called that, are veins, pumping life into something greater than mere human ambition. The first laws, the first trade routes, the first written words. Everything that defines the human experience took its first breath here, under the scorching sun, between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the dust of something almost lost. The city walls rise, defiant against time. They are old, impossibly old, yet even now, they whisper their secrets. The bricks, rough and sun-baked, bear the weight of generations, each layer pressed by hands that trembled with the realization that they were building something that had never been built before. Structures loom, ziggurats clawing at the heavens, their steps worn smooth by the feet of kings and priests, by those who once stood at the very edge of civilization and created what came next. But there is no peace here. Not truly. The gods demand more. Always more. The air is thick with the scent of offerings, burnt incense, fresh blood, the sweat of those who know that their survival depends on pleasing the unseen. The temple doors gape wide, swallowing the faithful whole. Somewhere inside, a priest murmurs in the dim glow of flickering lamps, his voice a thread in the fabric of reality, binding the mortal to the divine. Outside, the markets are restless. The sound of bartering is a language older than words, a dance of hands and voices, of urgency and hunger. Grain, wool, copper, everything has a price. The scales tip, agreements are struck, the weight of civilization balanced on the edge of a blade. A child watches, eyes wide, fingers curling around the hem of her mother's tunic. She does not know that she stands at the heart of history. She does not yet understand that this place, this moment, will echo through time, stretching beyond her, beyond all of them. But she will. Because nothing here is forgotten. Not really. The clay tablets keep their vigil, their etched symbols pressing stories into the bones of the earth. Sumer will not fade, not yet. The first civilization does not go quietly. It lingers, waiting, watching. And those who listen will hear it calling. The wind howls through the empty temple, a voice without a mouth, echoing off ancient stone. The fires have long since burned out, leaving only the ghosts of their warmth. The air is thick with something unseen, something that does not die, something that lingers. The gods are not gone. Their names are written in the bones of the world, carved into the clay, whispered in the dark corners of the earth. They do not fade. They do not rest. They watch. Anu, the sky, the silent force above all things, endless and unshaken. He is not a father in the way men understand. He does not hold, he does not comfort. He is vast. He is weightless. His will drifts down like an invisible tide, shaping destinies without ever touching them. The stars are his voice, cold and unblinking, telling stories only the gods can hear. Beneath him, Enlil moves like a storm, heavy with the weight of power, relentless in his fury. His breath is the wind, his anger the flood. He is order, control, the crushing hand that molds the world into what he deems fit. To stand before him is to feel the weight of mountains pressing against the soul, to know that defiance means ruin. The cities rise and fall at his command, kings grovel in the dust at his feet, and when he speaks, the air itself trembles. And then there is Enki, the trickster, the whisper in the silence. He does not command the storm, he bends it. He does not strike with the hammer, he shapes the blow before it lands. Knowledge drips from his fingers, seeps through the cracks of the world, into the hands of men who do not yet understand what they hold. He builds, he schemes, he saves. Even from the gods themselves. Ninhursag watches from the earth, her hand still stained with the clay of creation. She has molded flesh, sculpted bone, breathed life into dust. But she does not merely create, she owns what she births. She is the giver, the mother, the relentless force that does not let go. Her touch can heal, but it can also curse. Life bends beneath her hands, but so does suffering. Inanna. Beautiful. Terrifying. Desire and destruction in the same breath. She moves through the world like a fire, consuming, leaving nothing untouched. She is love. She is war. She is the reason men kneel in worship, and the reason they march to their deaths. Her laughter rings through the heavens, sweet as honey, sharp as knives. She does not beg. She does not ask. She takes. The gods do not sit idle. They are not distant. They do not forget. Their names still hang in the air, waiting to be spoken, waiting to be remembered. Because power this old does not vanish. It waits. The water is rising. Thick, black waves churn beneath the pale moon, licking the edges of the world like the tongue of something ancient, something starving. The river groans, swollen with the weight of knowledge, carrying whispers that slither through the reeds, through the cracks in the stone, through the lips of those who know too much. Somewhere in the shadows, a name is spoken. Not loudly. Not boldly. It slips through clenched teeth, a breath, a prayer, a warning. Enki. The first to shape. The first to see. The first to break the rules. He does not wear a crown of fire. He does not wield a blade of vengeance. He does not command with thunder, nor does he demand kneeling submission. His weapon is thought, his dominion the currents of the unseen. He moves like water, fluid, patient, unstoppable. When the world fractures, he does not shatter it. He bends it, twists it, reforms it in ways the other gods do not anticipate, in ways that leave them grasping at the ruins of their own decrees. They call him wise. But wisdom is not always welcome. He was there at the beginning, when the gods designed existence, when laws were written into the bones of the earth, when the first humans were crafted like clay dolls beneath the hands of the divine. They were not meant to think, not meant to know. They were to serve, to labor, to bow their heads in blind devotion. But Enki's hands did not simply shape flesh. They sculpted something far more dangerous, curiosity. And curiosity does not kneel. It questions. It hungers. It disobeys. So the flood came. The great erasure. The gods, drunk on their own power, tried to wipe the slate clean. They thought themselves just. They thought themselves victorious. But they did not account for Enki. While they spoke of destruction, he whispered survival. While they wielded storms, he wrote instructions. A man, a boat, a chance. The gods flooded the world, but Enki planted a seed beneath the waves. Life continued. Knowledge endured. Humanity persisted. For this, they called him a trickster. A betrayer. A god too dangerous to trust. But was it betrayal? Or was it the only act of mercy in a world of blind cruelty? Even now, the river carries his whispers. They curl in the foam, coil in the murky depths, waiting for those who listen, for those who seek, for those who understand. Enki is not a god of war. He does not conquer. But make no mistake, he is not weak. He is the god who chooses who will rise and who will remember. The sky is not empty. It watches. The stars do not twinkle with innocence, they burn with purpose, fixed in place by forces older than the oldest name ever spoken. They are not lights. They are not symbols. They are gods. Above the earth, unseen hands have woven a structure so vast, so absolute, that even the most powerful among the divine must obey its order. 3 levels. 3 fates. 3 dominions where existence itself plays out like a prophecy that no one dares to challenge. Above, the unreachable. The purest sky, where only the highest of gods reside, untouched by dust, by sorrow, by the crawling struggles of mortal hands. The home of Anu, the great father, the silent force who sees all but speaks only when the weight of the cosmos demands it. From here, decrees descend like falling stars, unbreakable, written into the fabric of reality itself. This is not a place for the living. It is barely a place for the divine. To enter is to be judged, to be measured against the expectations of eternity itself. Below, Ki, the cradle of men. A thin, fragile place, a brief flicker of existence between forces too great to be contained. A world of mud brick cities, of walls raised against chaos, of blood spilled to please unseen eyes. It is temporary. Everything here is borrowed, time, breath, flesh. Mortals move like shadows on water, reflections cast by something they cannot see. They live, they fight, they pray, and they are forgotten. And beneath it all, Irkalla. The land where silence devours sound, where footsteps leave no echoes, where the air is thick with something final. There is no torment here. No fire. No suffering crafted for the amusement of the gods. Just stillness. Just the slow, eternal decay of all that was once human. Ereshkigal reigns here, her grip as unyielding as stone. She does not rage. She does not weep. She does not bargain. Even the gods fear her halls, the blackened gates that swing shut with the weight of never returning. This is the Mesopotamian cosmos. A system without mercy. A structure that cannot be broken. But sometimes, something slips through the cracks. A whisper that should not be heard. A soul that refuses to be forgotten. A god who bends the rules while the others are not watching. Because even in a universe where everything is fixed, where the heavens are measured and the underworld waits for all, there are those who do not obey. The clay is cracked. Not by time. Not by accident. Something splintered these tablets, something that wanted the words gone. But words do not die so easily. They bleed through the ruins, through the dust of forgotten cities, through the hands of those who were never meant to read them. Words carved by reeds into wet earth, fired in the kilns of vanished civilizations, sealed in time. The Enumeraelish. The Atrahasis. The Eridu Genesis. Not stories. Blueprints. They whisper of beginnings, of gods who rose from darkness, of humanity designed in the throes of conflict. They were not written for pleasure. They were not meant for entertainment. These texts are warnings. In the Enuma Elish, there is no benevolent creation. No divine hand sculpting the world with gentle intent. There is war. Blood. A universe built from the corpse of a slain god. Tiamat, the mother of chaos, cut open like a sacrifice, her body stretched into the fabric of the sky. From her death, the world takes shape, not as an act of kindness, but of dominance. Marduk, the usurper, the god-king who was never meant to rule, fashions order from the bones of rebellion. He does not create out of love. He builds to maintain control. And then, as an afterthought, humanity. Born not from divinity, but from blood and servitude. Not to thrive, not to question, but to serve. The Atrahasis comes next. A text written in defiance, a whisper of discontent from within the priestly halls. It tells of a world where men are cattle, shackled to the will of the gods, forced to toil under endless labor. Until one day, they break. The cries of humanity rise so loudly that even the heavens cannot ignore them. The gods, uneasy, seek silence. And silence, to them, means destruction. The flood. Not a cleansing. Not a test. A calculated extinction. But then, Enki. The betrayer. The savior. The god who chooses to whisper when all others decree silence. He does not command. He does not strike with lightning or flame. He gives a warning, a secret, passed in hushed tones to one man alone. Build. Hide. Survive. And so, against the will of the heavens, humanity lives. The Eridu Genesis cements it. The final piece of the story no god wanted written. It speaks of kingship, not as power, but as a gift. A tool, forced upon humanity to keep them from slipping too close to chaos. To remind them of their place. These are not myths. They are echoes of something greater, something buried beneath centuries of rewritten truths. The tablets were cracked, the texts erased, but still, they whisper. And for those who listen, the past is not silent. The sky cracked open. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with will. A force so old it had no beginning, a presence so vast it had no shape. Anu, the unseen, the unmoving, the silent architect of all that was and would ever be, spoke. And from that utterance, the cosmos trembled. Beneath him, the void shuddered, folding into itself, birthing order from nothingness. The heavens stretched, the earth took form, and in the churning chaos of creation, power divided itself, two brothers, bound not by love, but by inevitability. Enlil. The storm. The law. The hand that separates. Enki. The water. The mind. The hand that mends. But before Enki had a name, before he had a shape, he was something else. A whisper in the veins of the universe, a force unborn yet present, waiting for the moment it would slip into existence like a secret never meant to be spoken. And when he came into being, the gods felt it. A ripple through the fabric of divinity. A shift. Born of Anu's blood, yet unlike his father. Born as Enlil's kin, yet destined to walk a path that neither the heavens nor the earth could contain. Enlil ruled the air, the winds, the storms that tore the sky apart. He was the judge, the decree, the weight of authority that could never be challenged. But Enki was different. He was not the storm, but the rain. Not the decree, but the whisper in the darkness before it was made. He did not take the heavens. He did not claim the air. Instead, he sank down into the Abzu, the primeval abyss, the subterranean ocean that cradled the roots of the world. Where others ruled above, Enki chose below. Where others commanded, he listened. Where others built walls, he dug paths. And the gods feared him for it. Because Enki did not wield power as a weapon, he shaped it. Molded it. Bent it. Not through force, not through command, but through knowing. A god of trickery. Of creation. Of rebellion in its quietest, deadliest form. And so, the tension between the brothers was written into the bones of the universe. Enlil, the storm, would forever stand in opposition to the water that softened stone. Law against wisdom. Order against adaptation. Strength against understanding. Anu watched. He did not interfere. He had set the game in motion, but he would not move the pieces. That was not his role. It was theirs. And thus, Enki stepped into history, into the stories that would be carved into the clay of the world. A god not of conquest, but of something far more dangerous. Change. The air is heavy. Not with heat, not with dust, but with something older. Something that clings to the bones of the land, something that watches. A silence that is not silence at all, but the weight of a presence that never left. The first city. Eridu. Not a city of conquest. Not a city of kings. Not a place born from blood and war, but called forth from nothing by a god whose hands did not destroy, but shaped. The ground here is wet. The soil, thick. The waters of the Abzu seep through the earth, curling around the foundation stones, feeding the roots of a city that was never meant to crumble. Because Eridu is not like the others. It is the beginning. Before Uruk. Before Nipper. Before all the great cities of men stood proud against the sky, there was this. The first bricks pressed into mud, the first altar raised in silent devotion, the first temple where mortals dared to offer their voices to something greater. A city built not in defiance, not in hunger for power, but in reverence. For Enki. For the god who did not sit upon the winds like Enlil. The god who did not throw bolts of fire like Ishki or wield the merciless blade of Nergal. No. Enki did not reign from above. He ruled from below. From the depths where life begins. And so, his city was not carved into mountains or perched upon high ground, it sank. Into the land, into the waters, into the very marrow of the world. A city that whispered instead of roared, that beckoned instead of conquered. The temple stands at its heart. Abzu. The house of the abyss. But it is not a house. It is a mouth. A passage. A thing that breathes with the currents below. The waters swell and retreat, the echoes of something alive rippling through its walls. The priests walk carefully here. They do not shout. They do not command. They listen. Because in Eridu, knowledge is not taken, it is given. If one is worthy. And the god himself? His presence is everywhere. In the canals that bleed through the city like veins. In the sacred wells where the water is darker, thicker, waiting to reveal what should never be spoken aloud. They say he still walks these streets when the moon is low. A figure half seen, half felt, trailing whispers that coil through the alleyways like mist. A god who does not demand sacrifices, but answers them. A god who does not seek worship, but inspires it. This is not a city of war. It is a city of secrets. And secrets never die. The water is black. Not with filth. Not with death. But with something far older. Something that never needed light. Beneath the earth, beneath the stone, beneath the weight of creation itself, it moves. Silent. Endless. Waiting. This is not a river. Not a sea. Not the raging tides of the surface world, where storms howl and waves shatter against the land. There is no roar here. No wind. No sky. Only the Abzu. It does not churn. It does not fight. It simply is. A vast, boundless ocean of fresh water, stretching through the underworld like veins through flesh, its current slow and knowing, pulling everything down. And within it, something watches. He does not sit upon a golden throne. He does not clutch a scepter or wear a crown that blinds the eye. No. Enki is the Abzu. The waters do not obey him, they are part of him, pouring through the fabric of existence itself, slipping into the cracks of reality, whispering knowledge into the bones of the world. For what is wisdom, if not water? It moves. It flows. It seeks. It carves through mountains, weaves through deserts, seeps into the hollows men would rather keep hidden. It remembers. The Abzu is not empty. It hums. It sings in vibrations too slow for human ears, too vast for mortal minds to grasp. Here, voices are swallowed before they can be spoken. Thoughts stretch into eternity before they are finished. Some say the first words were breathed into these waters. That before there was land, before there was sky, before even the gods themselves took shape, the Abzu was already listening. And it listens still. Its depths are endless. No mortal has seen the bottom and lived. No line, no weight, no measure has ever reached its true heart. Because it has no heart. It is the heart. Everything begins here. Not in the heavens, where Anu watches from his celestial throne. Not in the winds, where Enlil rips through the world like a blade. No, the true birth of all things is beneath, in the silence, in the waiting dark, where the first stirrings of thought bled into water and became something more. The Abzu does not give freely. It does not take easily. Those who come seeking knowledge do not leave unchanged. For knowledge is not a gift. It is a weight. A burden. A current that drags you further and further, until you are part of it, until you no longer remember the air above, until the world you once knew becomes nothing but a fading ripple on the surface. An Enki? He watches. A god who does not demand sacrifice, but witnesses it. A god who does not wage war, but ends it before it begins. A god whose power does not roar, does not strike, does not shatter, but seeps. Through cracks. Through flesh. Through thought. The Abzu cannot be caged. It cannot be drained. It cannot be tamed. Because it is waiting. And it does not forget. The air is heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. It clings to the skin, seeps into the lungs, pressing against the bones like an unspoken command. The silence is not empty, it hums, it watches. And then, a whisper. Not words. Not sound. Something older. Something woven into the fabric of existence itself. It does not beg to be understood, it demands it. The me. Not laws. Not rules. Not mere knowledge scribbled on clay tablets to be broken, rewritten, forgotten. No, this is different. This is the foundation of reality, the essence of what is. The shape of cities before the first stone was laid. The art of music before the first note was sung. The weight of kingship before the first man ever wore a crown. These are not gifts. They are not treasures to be hoarded or powers to be wielded like weapons. They are truths. Unyielding. Immutable. Ancient. And Enki holds them all. Not because he wants to. Not because he must. But because if he does not, the world unravels. The gods know this. The mortals do not. They look to him, their hands outstretched, their eyes wide with hunger, not for food, not for wealth, but for understanding. For the thing that sets them apart, lifts them above the beasts, drags them from the mud and into the light. But understanding is never given. It is taken. The first time a man reaches for fire, he burns. The first time a man tastes power, he chokes. The first time a man speaks a word that bends the world bends him in return. The me does not grant wisdom. It tests it. Enki knows this better than any god. He does not hold the me like a tyrant clutches a scepter. He does not keep them locked away, far from mortal hands. That is not his way. He does not hoard, does not starve the world of its own making. He releases them. Slowly. Carefully. Like a river breaking a dam, letting the waters spill forth in trickles before the flood. Too much at once, and the world drowns. Not all gods understand this. Some think the me should be hoarded, kept out of mortal grasp, locked within the heavens where only divine hands may touch them. They do not trust men. Do not trust the hunger that drives them, the ambition that twists them, the recklessness that makes them dangerous. Enki does. Because he sees. Because he knows. Not all will be wise. Not all will be worthy. Some will take and break. Some will twist what was given, forge weapons from wisdom, wield knowledge like a blade. But others? Others will build. Others will lift. Others will take the me into their bones and become something more. And so, Enki lets them slip through his fingers. One by one. Not hoarded. Not stolen. Given. A mother, whispering the first lullaby to a wailing infant, music. A man, kneeling before the dead, pressing clay over lifeless lips, burial rites. A builder, lifting stone upon stone, shaping the air into walls, architecture. A king, seated upon his throne, the weight of his people pressing upon his chest, kingship. One by one, they fall into mortal hands. One by one, they take root in the world. And with every gift, with every whisper, with every silent, unseen release, Enki watches. Not as a master watches a slave. Not as a god watches an insect. But as a father watches a child take their first, trembling steps. There will be missteps. There will be failures. There will be horrors beyond reckoning. But there will also be greatness. And Enki, keeper of the me, smiles. The gods watch, but they do not understand. Not fully. Not the way he does. A silence lingers, thick and waiting, just before the world shifts. It is in this moment, this held breath, this fragile stillness, that Enki smiles. It is never a wide, beaming thing. No, it is subtle, a glimmer of something unreadable in the depth of his eyes. A flicker of mischief. A sliver of knowing. And then, the world tilts. A king wakes to find his power slipping through his fingers like water. A god reaches for wrath, only to find mercy has already been woven into the threads of fate. A city built on the promise of control crumbles beneath the weight of its own greed. Enki's hands are everywhere. But they are never where one expects them to be. He is the whisper in the darkness, the clever twist in the tale, the unexpected kindness that cuts like a blade. He does not stand where the gods expect him to stand. He does not play fair. Because fair is an illusion. Fair is a rule made by those who wish to trap others within it. Enki bends, shifts, weaves through the fabric of what is known, slipping between wisdom and mischief as if they are one and the same. Because they are. The wise man is the trickster. The trickster is the wise man. To see what others do not see, that is wisdom. To know how to move unseen, to pull the right thread and let the world stumble into its own fate, that is cunning. He does not lie. Not truly. He does not need to. Truth itself is a weapon in the hands of one who knows how to wield it. A misplaced word, a slight omission, a truth so precise it wraps itself around the mind like a riddle. That is all it takes. Some call him treacherous. A deceiver. A god who bends oaths and shapes fate with a smirk on his lips. They are not wrong. But they are not right, either. Because when the floodwaters rise, when the sky cracks open, when death marches forward with a hunger that will not be sated, who stands between annihilation and survival? Not the gods who bind themselves to their own rigid decrees. Not the ones who see only what should be, instead of what must be. No. It is him. The one who cheats fate, because fate itself is just another thread in his hands. The one who whispers to the desperate man in the night, guiding him toward salvation. The one who steals wisdom from the heavens, not for himself, but for the hands of mortals who do not yet understand the weight of what they have been given. The gods curse him, yet they turn to him when the world begins to burn. The mortals fear him, yet they owe him their breath. He is a paradox. A contradiction. The hand that guides, the hand that deceives. Enki. The trickster. The sage. The god who knows. The silence before the first breath was absolute. No sound. No light. No time. Only the weight of what was not, a void so still it felt like suffocation, an absence that stretched endlessly, waiting. Then, something stirred. A ripple in the nothingness. A whisper of movement where there had been none. The silence shuddered, cracking under the strain of something inevitable. The first waters rose from the abyss, cold and endless, the Abzu swelling into existence with a force that shook the void. Darkness still ruled, but it had lost its grip. The silence, once unchallenged, now had a rival. And within those waters, within the churning womb of the abyss, Enki opened his eyes. He did not come from fire. He was not born in violence. His was the quiet power of the depths, the mind that moved beneath the surface, the force that shaped without being seen. He was knowledge before there was wisdom. The sky had not yet been split from the earth, but the seed of creation had already been planted. Then came Anu, the sky, vast and looming, stretching himself over the endless surge of water. His presence pulled the world into order, lifting it from chaos with the weight of his dominion. Enlil followed, the storm, the force, the roaring voice that would one day command gods and men alike. But even as they took their places, even as the foundations of the world groaned under the shaping hands of divine will, it was Enki who watched. The sky could not yet hold its own weight. The earth lay hidden beneath the waters. Nothing was formed, only struggling to be. He felt the ache of it, the disorder humming beneath the surface, the raw potential waiting to be shaped. The others would break, would force, would carve the world into being. But Enki moved. He slipped between what was and what must be, a shadow in the shaping, a hand unseen. He carved channels through the endless waters, giving them paths, names, purpose. The rivers bled from his touch, winding like veins, their waters no longer lost in the chaos of the abyss. The marshes rose, breathing, drinking from the flow he had gifted them. Still, the world was not yet whole. The sky loomed too far, distant and unanchored. The earth had yet to stand firm beneath its weight. Enki's hands worked in silence, unseen by the gods who shouted their wills into existence. He reached into the depths, into the unshaped clay beneath the Abzu, and pulled land from the nothingness. He pressed his fingers into the soil, sculpting its form, giving the earth a shape that could hold the heavens above it. Then, he let the sky rest. Let it lean upon the peaks of mountains, let it stretch upon the back of the land he had lifted from the abyss. The world breathed for the first time. But a world without life is nothing more than an empty shell. The rivers did not yet thirst. The winds did not yet carry the scent of living things. Enki's hands had not finished their work. He wove reeds into being, let them drink from the marshes and stretch toward the heavens. He shaped fish from the waters, let them slip into the veins of the world. He whispered to the trees, guiding their roots deep, anchoring them to the land so they would never be lost again. Still, something was missing. The gods would claim dominion over this world, but who would keep it breathing? Who would till the earth, walk the rivers, sing praises to those who had shaped it? The sky and the earth had been split. The waters had been tamed. The land had been lifted from the abyss. But there were no hands to hold it, no voices to name it. And so, Enki turned once more to the clay. He reached into the damp earth, fingers curling around the raw potential of what could be. He pressed his thumb into the wet surface, sculpting form from formlessness. He pulled limbs from the mud, stretched fingers into existence, shaped the curve of a back, the bend of a knee, the swell of a chest that would one day heave with breath. The gods watched. They had not considered this. The world had been made for them. What need was there for another presence? Another force to move through the land they had shaped? Enki did not ask. He pressed his lips to the clay, exhaled, and the world shifted once more. The first heartbeat echoed across the land. The first breath shuddered through lungs that had never known air. Eyes opened. And in them, Enki saw something none of the other gods had considered, understanding. Not the raw, absolute power of Anu. Not the violent will of Enlil. Not the chaos of the abyss. No. This was something else. A reflection of himself. A spark of the wisdom that had moved unseen beneath the surface of creation. A sliver of the cunning that had shaped the world without force, without war, without command. The others had not seen it. But they would. because in that moment, in the hush before the first words were spoken, Enki understood what he had done. This was not a servant. Not a tool for the gods to wield. This was something new. Something that could think. The sky and the earth had been split. The waters had been tamed. The land had been lifted. And now, the world had a mind of its own. The other gods would not yet grasp the weight of it. But Enki did. And as the first human rose from the clay, trembling and uncertain, the god of wisdom and trickery did what he always did. He smiled. The gods were restless. Their hands, once eager to mold existence, now trembled with exhaustion. The weight of their creation pressed upon them, rivers that needed guiding, fields that hungered for sowing, temples that stood silent, waiting for worship. The world had been formed, but it was hollow, an empty stage with no players. The heavens loomed, indifferent. The earth stretched beneath them, patient. But the gods, they were weary. And so, the murmurs began. A solution, whispered between deities like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The burden must be lifted. The hands of the gods must be freed. But who would bear the weight? Enki listened. He always listened. He sat in the silence beneath the world, where the waters of the Abzu cradled his thoughts, where wisdom flowed like an unseen current. He had shaped the land, had given the rivers their voices, had carved order from the chaos. But this was different. This was not shifting earth or whispering to reeds. This was something new. The gods would shape a being. A creature to labor, to till the soil, to build the temples, to fill the air with prayers and praises. A servant of the divine. But Enki knew better. He did not speak, did not argue. He simply let the idea fester, let it grow, let it take root in the minds of the others until they believed it was theirs. When the time came, they turned to Ninhursag, the Great Mother, the womb of creation, the goddess whose hands had always sculpted life from the unshaped. She stood at the edge of the marshes, where the waters kissed the land, where the clay lay thick and dark, pulsing with the memory of the abyss. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the wet earth, feeling its hunger, its potential. Enki was beside her, silent, watching. She scooped the clay into her hands, let it drip between her fingers, studying its weight, its texture, its pliability. "This will be the flesh," she said. Enki dipped his hand into the water, let it swirl around his fingers, let it seep into the clay she held. "And this will be the spirit," he murmured. They worked together, shaping, molding, breathing life into the formless. The gods watched, silent now, wary. They had demanded servants. But something about this act felt different. The words hang, cold and final. Ninhursag pressed her thumb into the clay, carving out the curve of a brow, the slope of a nose. Her fingers sculpted the bend of a spine, the hollows where ribs would cage the breath. Enki traced the lips with the tip of his finger, marking them not just for speech, but for thought. He ran his hands along the clay limbs, ensuring they were not just strong for toil, but nimble for creation. He smiled when Ninhursag's hands trembled. She felt it too. The weight of this act. The risk. "Are we making servants?" she whispered. Enki did not answer. She pressed her palm against the figure's chest. "It needs something more." Enki nodded. He reached into the depths of the Abzu, into the current that held the whispers of all things, secrets carried in the undertow, knowledge that even the gods had yet to grasp. He pulled forth something unseen, something dangerous, something new. And he gave it to the clay. Ninhursag exhaled sharply as the figure shuddered in her hands. A tremor passed through the wet earth, a pulse, a heartbeat that did not belong to the gods, did not belong to the land or the sky or the sea. It belonged to them. A breath. A cough. Then, eyes opened. Not the dull, empty gaze of a beast. Not the glassy reflection of servitude. No. These eyes saw. Enki did not move. Did not speak. He simply waited. The gods stepped closer, their whispers now fearful. They had expected laborious Silent creatures, obedient, mindless. But this? The figure sat up, clay cracking at the joints, damp earth shedding in flakes as movement became real. The breath came again, shaky, uncertain. Hands flexed. Fingers curled. A shiver ran through the new body as nerves awoke for the first time, a sensation flooded in where there had once been nothing. Then, the head lifted. The eyes met Enki's. An understanding passed between them. Ninhursag's breath caught. She had felt it too, in the shaping, in the molding of the clay. They had not simply created a worker. They had not sculpted a beast of burden. They had made something else. A being that could question. That could know. Enki tilted his head, studying this new thing, this fragile creature with bones of earth and a heart of water. He wondered, in that moment, if he had made a mistake. If the gods would turn on him, if they would crush this experiment before it could stand. But then, the figure moved. It turned its hands over, studying its own fingers, its own form. It placed a palm against its chest, feeling the rhythm inside. A flicker of realization. Then, the first word. Soft. Hoarse. But filled with something that had never before existed in this world. Why? The gods recoiled. Enki smiled. The wind howled through the desolate fields, sweeping dust into the hollow ribs of those who toiled beneath the weight of an endless sky. Bent backs, calloused hands, bodies fashioned from clay yet burdened as if they were stone. The earth beneath them bore their footprints, but it did not know their names. They worked, because they must. They existed, because the gods willed it. A man lifted his head, his cracked lips parting, but no words came. There was no need. The sun had already begun its slow descent, its burning gaze retreating behind the horizon, yet still, the labor did not cease. The gods watched from their thrones of gold and fire, and the work continued. It must always continue. The sweat that dripped from their brows did not belong to them. It was an offering, a silent hymn, a sacrifice to those who shaped the world and dictated its course. To halt was unthinkable. To refuse was impossible. The hands that molded them from the silent mud had pressed a purpose into their very bones. They were not beasts, but neither were they free. Somewhere, a child cried, a thin, reedy sound, lost in the wind. A mother hushed it with trembling fingers, her arms weak from harvesting the grain that she would never taste. She whispered into the child's ear words of nothingness, promises she could never keep. But still, she whispered, because it was the only thing she had. The gods had spoken long ago. The world was theirs, a place of divine will, shaped by hands that knew the power of creation. But power was heavy. It crushed even those who wielded it. And so, mankind was shaped not in love, not in mercy, but in necessity. Enki had known this when he let the first man rise from the clay. He had seen the weight settle into their bones before they had even taken their first breath. It was inevitable. Their purpose was not to rule, nor to wander freely under the open sky. Their purpose was written in the furrows of the land, in the temples that scraped the heavens, in the sweat that slicked their backs as they bent beneath burdens too great to name. The priests called them blessed. Blessed to raise the bricks that formed the ziggurats, stacking them higher, closer to the gods who watched with cold, unblinking eyes. Blessed to kneel before the altars, pressing their foreheads to the ground in gratitude for the chance to serve. Blessed to till the fields, to carve irrigation channels, to shape the earth itself as if their own hands could mimic those who had made them. The word curdled on the tongue. Blessed. Yet the gods did not labor. Their hands were clean, untouched by toil. Their temples gleamed, not by their own effort, but by the hands of those who were made to serve. A boy staggered beneath the weight of a stone too heavy for his small frame. He gritted his teeth, his arms trembling, but he did not drop it. He could not. There was no choice. The stone was his burden, just as breath was his right, just as labor was his purpose. A woman knelt in the river, her hands raw from washing the linens of those who would never spare her a glance. The water lapped against her wrists, cold and indifferent, carrying away the dirt, but never the ache. An old man fell to his knees in the fields, his body betraying him at last. His hands, which had spent a lifetime shaping the land, grasped at the dust as if seeking something, some meaning, some acknowledgement of all he had given. But the earth did not answer. The gods did not stir. And still, the work continued. Enki watched. He had given them the spark, had pressed something into the clay that should never have been there. He had seen it in the eyes of the first man, in that whispered why? That had sent ripples through the order of things. But what use was why when the answer never changed? The gods ruled. The people served. It was the way of things. It had always been the way of things. A girl stood at the edge of a temple courtyard, her bare feet dusted with the dirt of a land she did not own. She looked up at the towering walls, at the steps that stretched into the sky, leading to those who never walked among them. She had never touched a god. Never seen one except in stone, in gold, in statues too heavy for her small hands to lift. Yet they ruled her. They dictated the path of her days, the rhythm of her existence. Her fingers curled into fists. The wind shifted. A strange, unfamiliar thing stirred in the dust at her feet. It whispered, not in the language of the gods, but in something older, something buried beneath centuries of toil and silence. Something that pulsed in the blood, unspoken, but never forgotten. A heartbeat. A question. She exhaled. Then, she turned back to the fields, to the temples, to the endless labor that stretched before her like an unbroken chain. And she worked. Because that was what she was made for. The silence was absolute. A hush so thick it smothered the very air, pressing against the skin like unseen hands. The firelight flickered in the temple's shadows, twisting shapes against the stone walls, making the gods themselves seem to shift and breathe. Beneath their unblinking gaze, a man knelt, his fingers digging into the cold earth. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Something had changed. The world was not as it had been. The others did not see it. Not yet. Their hands still lifted bricks, still tilled the land, still bowed before statues that did not speak. But he saw. He felt. And the weight of it crushed him more than any burden the gods had placed upon his back. A whisper slithered through his mind, coiling tight around his thoughts, a voice that was not a voice, a breath against the spine. It was there in the dark, in the silent space between heartbeats, in the ember glow of an unseen fire. It was Enki. It had always been Enki. Not the thunderous decree of Enlil, nor the sharp-edged judgment of the others. No. This was different. Subtle. A ripple in still water, a thing done in shadows, unnoticed, until it was far too late to stop. The gods had molded them from clay, pressed labor into their bones, and bound them to servitude. But clay was pliable. It could be shaped. It could be altered. Enki had slipped something into the mold. A fragment of fire, an ember stolen from the hands of those who claimed dominion over all. He had placed it inside their minds, pressed it into their very being, so small at first, so quiet, that even the gods had not seen. But now it was growing. The man clenched his fists, his breath ragged. He could think. Not just obey, not just move at the gods' will, but think. He could question. He could doubt. And doubt was a dangerous thing. He turned his face upward, his eyes burning with something that had never belonged to humans before. The statues above him, chiseled into perfect, frozen expressions, loomed like silent judges. They did not speak, did not stir. They never had. He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The others, if they knew, if they saw what he had seen, would they fear him? Would they call him cursed? Or worse, would they awaken too? He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. Outside the temple, the night stretched endless and black, the stars cold pinpricks against the abyss. He had looked at them 1,000 times before, but now he saw them. Not as the glimmering lights of distant gods, not as things beyond reach. But as something else. Something waiting to be understood. A shudder passed through him. The gods had given them breath, given them flesh, given them a place beneath their feet, but Enki had given them something far more dangerous. Awareness. A gift. A curse. A fire in the blood that could never be put out. And now that it had been given, it could never be taken back. The ground trembled. Not with the footsteps of gods, not with the weight of the heavens pressing upon the land, but with something far more dangerous. The air itself had changed, charged with fury, thick with the unspeakable tension of those who had reached the end of their chains. They were coming. The Igigi, once silent, once obedient, now rose in defiance. No longer shadows in the sky, no longer silent hands tending the work of their masters. Their voices, unheard for so long, now raged like a storm about to break. The forges lay cold. The bricks lay unstacked. The endless toil that had stretched across eternity had stopped. The gods had built their world upon the backs of these beings, pressing them into labor beneath a sky that never wept for them. But even the most unyielding stone will crack beneath too much weight. And something had cracked. At the heart of it all, in the great city of the gods, Enlil's palace doors stood sealed. Thick pillars reached into the heavens, a monument to dominion, to order, an order that now frayed at its edges. Outside, the sky pulsed with the light of torches, hundreds, thousands. The Igigi had gathered, their hands calloused, their bodies worn, their eyes burning with something no god had expected to see. Revolt! It surged through their blood, through the air, through the very bones of the world. It was not a question, not a plea. It was a demand. Inside, the gods stirred. Enlil, the great lord of decree, sat unmoving, his expression carved from stone, but his fingers curled into his palms. He knew. They all knew. The balance had shifted. But Enki was already moving. Through the corridors of the divine halls, past the unseeing statues and the gilded walls, he walked, calm, deliberate. His thoughts moved faster than the stars, weaving paths through the chaos, tracing lines of fate that had not yet been drawn. The gods were gods. Their word was law, their will was absolute. But what is law when those who serve it refuse to kneel? A single moment. That's all it took. A single moment to change the course of eternity. Enki reached the great gates. His hand pressed against the stone, cool beneath his palm. Beyond, the Igigi raged. He could hear them. The breaking of their chains, the roar of their voices. He did not fear them. Because he understood them. He had always understood. The gods saw laborious. Servants. Tools. But Enki saw something far more dangerous, far more powerful. He saw will. And will could not be shackled forever. The sky pulsed with firelight as he stepped forward, not as a master, not as a king, but as something far more unpredictable, a mediator, a trickster, a god who knew when to bend the world rather than let it shatter. His voice was not thunder, not the wrath of a storm. It was something else. Something sharper, something that slid between anger and reason, between fury and fate. A deal. A choice. A new way. The gods would not break their backs. The gods would not grind them into the dust of their own creation. There would be another way. And so, Enki did what no other god could. He gave them an escape. A creation born from necessity, a solution pulled from the threads of chaos itself. Clay, molded by divine hands, shaped into something lesser but capable. Flesh that could bleed, but also endure. A new laborer. Humans. The gods would have their workers. The Igigi would have their freedom. It was done before anyone could stop it, before Enlil could raise his voice in protest, before the heavens could split in fury. Balance, not by force, not by decree, but by a trick well played. The fires in the night dimmed. The voices quieted. The world shifted once more. And Enki, the cunning, the wise, the unpredictable, smiled in the shadows. The heavens held their breath. The air was thick, charged, waiting. Not with peace, not with silence, but with something more ancient, more primal. A tension stretched so tight it hummed, threading through the fabric of existence itself. The cosmos had always belonged to two forces, two minds, two wills. And now, they stood against each other, not in open battle, but in something far worse. A war of purpose. A war of gods. The sky split in two, one half a storm without mercy, rolling black clouds devouring the horizon, the other a whispering tide, a river that did not crash, but carved, reshaped, shifted. One, a tyrant's decree. The other, a trickster's hand. Enlil's voice was the wind that toppled mountains. The force that demanded obedience, the will that bent the world to order. He had ruled with an iron grip, unmoved, unquestioned. The king of storms, the hammer of the heavens, the law that no god nor man could defy. But there was one. Enki stood where the water met the sky, where the shifting tides defied the permanence of the storm. His power was not in thunder, not in might, but in the spaces in between, in the cracks that no decree could seal shut. He was the whisper of change, the hand that shaped without breaking. And he was watching. Waiting. Smiling. It had always been this way. Two brothers, two rulers, bound by blood but divided by fate. Enlil had taken the sky, the power, the throne that dictated all. And he had ruled without mercy. His law was absolute, his judgment final. But Enki had taken the waters, the earth beneath the rule of kings, the places where control was an illusion. The trickster god, the wise one, the serpent that slithered beneath the order of the world and wove his own design. The gods had chosen their sides. Some knelt before Enlil, before the weight of his word, before the relentless storm that crushed all beneath it. But others, they whispered their prayers to Enki, to the one who saw beyond rules, beyond the rigid lines drawn by power. The one who knew how to shift fate itself. And now, the struggle that had simmered beneath the bones of the world for an eternity was reaching its breaking point. The flood had been the first blow. Enlil, furious, unyielding, had called for destruction. Mankind, the creation of Enki's hands, the laborious who toiled for the gods, weak, mortal, insignificant. A failure in Enlil's eyes. They were to be erased, drowned beneath the endless fury of the storm, swept away as if they had never been. And Enki had watched. Watched as the clouds gathered, as the sky blackened, as Enlil's wrath built into something unstoppable. And then, at the last moment, when the gods turned their backs, when the flood was already spilling over the edge of the world, Enki whispered. Not a roar, not a command. Just a whisper. To one man. One chance. A warning. A defiance. And when the waters receded, when the land lay broken and the air reeked of death, one figure remained standing. Alive. Saved. Enlil had raged. The heavens had trembled with his fury. Enki had smiled. It was never about open war. Never about battlefields or blades. It was about control. Who held the world in their grasp? Who decided its fate? Enlil, with his unbreakable laws, his merciless decrees. Or Enki, with his quiet, careful hands, shaping the world in ways unseen. The struggle did not end with the flood. It could not end. Every creation, every change, every act of defiance fed the fire between them. Enlil sought order. He carved rules into the bones of the earth. He shaped the heavens with rigid lines, with unyielding purpose. He saw himself as the architect of existence, the one who tamed chaos and made the universe bend to his will. But Enki saw the cracks in the foundation. He saw what the world could be, not what it was forced to be. And so, he whispered his secrets into the ears of men, gave them tools, gave them knowledge, gave them the means to question the order that had been forced upon them. For every rule Enlil set in stone, Enki found a way to break it. For every wall built, he found a door. For every law spoken, he gave men the power to choose. And so, the struggle continued. Not in war, not in blood, but in something far greater. A battle for the soul of the world. A battle that had no end. A battle that had only just begun. The land was untouched. A paradise suspended between the heavens and the world below, where the rivers did not run dry, where the wind carried no dust, where death had never set its foot. Dilmun, golden, radiant, pure. And yet, something pulsed beneath its perfection, something unseen, waiting to shatter the silence. The gods watched over it, but none so closely as she. Ninhursag, the mother of life, the goddess who shaped flesh and wove souls into being, walked the land with quiet authority. Every leaf, every stone, every blade of grass had felt her touch, her breath. But something stirred in the stillness, something that did not belong. A shift in the order of things, like a ripple across the surface of a still lake. She turned. And there he stood. Enki. The god of wisdom, of mischief, of depths both seen and unseen. His hands had shaped the rivers that kissed the land. His will had guided the waters to nourish the soil, to bring life where none had been. But his eyes, they were never still. They held a hunger not for power, not for conquest, but for something more dangerous. Possibility. It was said that nothing in Dilmun could wither, nothing could decay. It was a land untouched by pain, by suffering. A place of untouched beauty. And Enki, in his endless curiosity, in his restless need to reshape the world, had found something forbidden. The sacred fruit. Rich, bursting with life, untouched by death, untouched by time. She saw it too late. His fingers had already plucked it from the branch, already lifted it to his lips. A single bite, a single swallow, and something shifted in the air. A crack. A fracture in the perfect stillness. Ninhursag's voice was the weight of storms, the force of creation itself. You have done what should not be done. Enki only smiled. Not in arrogance. Not in defiance. But in something worse. Understanding. It was meant to be tasted, he said, voice smooth as the rivers he commanded. What is creation, if not something that must change? But the change that came was not the one he expected. The bite he had taken was not just of fruit, not just of life, it was of power beyond even his own comprehension. A power meant for the gods alone, for the hands of the Divine Mother. And now, it rebelled within him. A burning. A breaking. Pain, where pain had never been. Enki, the god of wisdom, the unshakable, the eternal, fell. His body twisted, breath sharp, hands clawing at the ground as something inside him warred against his very essence. It burrowed through him, tearing at his flesh, his organs, his bones. A suffering unknown to the gods, a torment foreign even to death itself. Ninhursag watched, and for the first time in all of existence, she did not know what to do. He had taken what was not his to take. The price had been set. And yet, he was Enki. The trickster. The architect of fate. The one whose hands had shaped the very waters that gave life to the land she ruled. She could let him suffer. Let his own foolishness consume him, let his body be torn apart by the force he had swallowed whole. Or she could break the laws of the gods once more. She knelt. Her fingers traced the burning places in his body, the places where the stolen power sought to tear him apart. From his ribs, from his sides, from the very marrow of his being, she pulled life. One by one, they took form. Healing deities, born from his agony, shaped from his pain. They did not weep for him, for they were his salvation. One for the ribs, one for the shoulders, one for the throat, one for the heart. Where the power had burrowed, where the suffering had taken root, there they emerged, one after another, born of the wound and the cure alike. And with them, the pain began to fade. His breath steadied. His hands unclenched. The storm in his body stilled, the war within finally silenced. Enki, god of wisdom, god of chaos, opened his eyes. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be broken. What it meant to be healed. Ninhursag did not speak as she rose to her feet, as she turned from him, as she walked away. There were no words for what had passed between them, no law to define what had just been done. Only the truth that now lay in the land of Dilmun, unshaken yet forever changed. A land no longer untouched. a paradise no longer perfect. But perhaps, now, something greater. The air was thick with incense and laughter. The waters of Eridu lapped gently against the temple walls, reflecting the wavering glow of 1,000 golden lamps. Inside, where the scent of sweet dates mixed with the heady spice of aged wine, the god of wisdom sat, his mind sinking beneath the weight of intoxication. Enki, lord of the Abzu, keeper of the sacred me, master of creation and chaos alike, laughed, a deep, rolling sound that shook the very foundation of his hall. His goblet was never empty, his hands never still, his mind never at rest. He had shaped the world, molded rivers, breathed life into clay, bent the very order of existence to his will. But tonight, there was no creation. Only indulgence. Anha. Inanna. She sat across from him, a goddess made of fire and silk, eyes dark as the void between stars. Queen of love, of war, of desire, of hunger that could never be sated. She poured his drink, fingers trailing along the rim of his cup like the whisper of a promise. "Drink, Enki," she purred. "Tonight is a night for gifts, is it not?" His lips curled. "What more could you want, little goddess? Have you not already stolen the hearts of men, conquered the whispers of the wind?" She smiled. And Enki, wise as he was, should have known then, should have seen it in the gleam of her teeth, the glint in her eyes, the careful way she leaned closer, voice low and rich as honey left too long in the sun. "I only wish to learn, great Enki. To know what you know. To hold in my hands the wonders of the me. The me. The sacred decrees. The laws that bound the world, that shaped civilization, that breathed order into the chaos of existence." He laughed again, tipping his goblet to his lips. The wine was warm, sweet, dark. It filled him, clouded him, made his hands light and his thoughts weightless. She waited. He gestured, grand and careless. "Then take them. What is knowledge if it is not shared?" Her breath hitched, just for a moment. Then she smiled, reaching for the tablets before the weight of his words could settle in his drunken mind. One by one, she took them. The me of kingship, of war, of writing, of song. The me of wisdom, of trade, of judgment, of love. Each one slid into her grasp like a shadow slipping through fingers. Enki did not stop her. He drank. And drank. And drank. Until the lamps burned low, and the air was thick with the scent of wine and the echoes of careless laughter. And by then, she was gone. The silence was wrong. His head throbbed. His tongue was thick with the aftertaste of indulgence. His fingers, once wrapped around the rim of a goblet, now grasped at nothing but air. The me. He bolted upright, the weight of his own mistake crashing down upon him like the great floods he had once commanded. His hall was empty. The sacred decrees, the foundation of the world, vanished. And she was already far away. Inanna, the unrelenting, the unstoppable, the storm with no master, had taken them. The waters outside were no longer calm. A great tide swelled, called forth by Enki's fury. He rose, his voice breaking the night like thunder shattering the sky. "Bring her back! Bring the me back to Eridu!" His servants scattered, the currents of the great Abzu twisting beneath their feet. They rode the waves, chasing after the goddess who had stolen the heart of creation itself. But Inanna had already set sail. Her boat cut through the water like a knife through flesh, the sacred me wrapped in cloth, held close against her chest. She did not stop. Not for the cries of the waves. Not for the wind that howled through the reeds. Not even when Enki's servants appeared before her, hands outstretched, voices demanding, pleading, threatening. She only smiled. And one by one, she sent them back empty-handed. She was not just a goddess of love. She was war. And she would not yield. Enki watched from the waters, rage burning in his chest, in his throat, in his very bones. But beneath it, beneath the storm of his fury, was something else. Something cold. Something inevitable. He had given them to her. He, in his arrogance, in his indulgence, in his foolish belief that he alone controlled the tides of fate. And now, the world had shifted. The me no longer rested in Eridu. They belonged to her. To Inanna. To Uruk. To the hands of a goddess who would not be bound by the laws of old, who would shape the world not in the image of wisdom, but in the image of her own unrelenting hunger. And Enki, for all his power, for all his fury, could do nothing but watch as she disappeared into the horizon, taking the fate of the world with her. The waters whispered his name. Enki. God of wisdom. Lord of the Abzu. Shaper of destinies. He was not meant to love. Not meant to hunger. And yet, he did. The nights were restless with desire, the weight of creation pressing against him like an unspoken truth. He was meant to govern, to craft, to shape the bones of the world. But there were moments, stolen moments, when he did not think of order. Only of touch. The first was Ninhursag. She was earth itself, unyielding, fierce, with a beauty that could crack stone and a fire that could reduce gods to embers. She did not bow before him. Did not wait for him to call. When she came to him, it was not with submission but with a challenge in her eyes. Take from me, she had whispered, if you can. And so, he did. Their love was war, violent and unrelenting. The ground trembled beneath them, the waters rose, and from their passion came the first, their daughter, Ninsa. She was life, green and blooming, but Enki was never meant to stay. Ninhursag watched him go, watched him slip through her fingers like the tides retreating from the shore. She should have known. Should have seen it in his eyes, the restlessness, the endless hunger. He did not return. Not to her. But to Ninsa. His own blood, untouched, unclaimed by another. She had her mother's fire, but she did not fight him. She did not know that she could. She bloomed beneath his touch, and from their union another was born, an Inanna, the goddess of the mountain pastures, the soft whisper of green against stone. But he did not stop. The cycle continued. Again. And again. And again. Ninkara bore him Utu, the weaver of fate, the goddess whose hands wove the threads of destiny itself. But she was different. She had learned. She did not trust him. She sought counsel, whispered her fears to Ninhursag, who still burned with old wounds. And this time, the earth goddess acted. She hid Utu away, fed her the wisdom of bitter plants, taught her to refuse him. When Enki came, Utu did not fall to his touch. She did not bloom for him. Instead, she tricked him, casting his seed upon the earth. And Ninhursag, vengeful and unrelenting, cursed him. He withered. His flesh ached, his bones hollowed, his own creation betraying him. She let him suffer. Let him feel the agony of what it meant to take without restraint. Only when the cries of the gods filled the heavens did she show mercy. One by one, she healed him. One by one, she named the pains he bore. It should have ended there. But Enki was not a god who learned. The waters called him again. And again. Sirimu, the serpent goddess, called in the depths, whispering his name with a forked tongue. He took her, and she bore him sons who would slither through the cracks of existence, spreading his essence like a creeping flood. Damgalnuna, the radiant queen, bound herself to him, bore him Marduk, the god who would one day rise above them all. Every touch left echoes. Every union carved new lines into the bones of the world. Enki did not stop. He was wisdom. But he was also chaos. Creation and destruction wrapped in the form of a god who could not be bound. And the world, for better or worse, would never be the same. The laughter was soft, almost imperceptible, yet it carried through the halls of the gods like a shadow stretching under torchlight. A whisper of amusement where there should have been silence. A flicker of mischief in a world built on rigid, unbending law. The gods were at war, though no blood had been spilled, yet. They sat upon their thrones of fire and stone, voices sharp as the edges of the cosmos, unraveling their grievances with tongues that had shaped the very foundations of existence. power clashed against power, divine will locked in a battle that had no victor. And then, Enki spoke. Not with the fury of Enlil. Not with the unshaken resolve of Anu. His voice was smooth, a river gliding through jagged rock, wearing it down bit by bit, unseen, unstoppable. A suggestion. A tilt of his head. A hand raised, not in force, but in invitation. The gods did not realize they had already lost. The game had begun long before they had arrived, long before their grievances had solidified into threats. Enki did not fight wars, he wove them. He did not raise armies, he whispered into the ears of kings, bent the will of gods as easily as a stream carves the land. He watched as the balance teetered, as the old gods clenched their fists around power while the younger ones gnawed at the edges, hungry for what was withheld. They saw chaos. He saw opportunity. A god spoke, Ishtar, perhaps, or Ninurta, her voice laced with rage, demanding justice, retribution, an answer to an insult she could not allow to stand. Enki smiled. Not wide enough to be seen. Not enough to be noticed. But it was there. He leaned forward, elbows resting against the smooth obsidian of the divine council table, his fingers barely tapping the surface, an erratic rhythm, a pulse only he could hear. And then, a lie. Not spoken, not declared, but breathed into the air between them. A shift in memory. A recollection twisted just slightly, so subtly that even those who had witnessed the truth felt doubt coil around their thoughts. Had it happened that way? Had Enlil's decree been absolute? Had the goddess truly spoken those words in defiance? Or had it been something softer, something easily forgiven if only seen from another angle? The council stirred. Fury dulled, blades lowered. Enki's eyes gleamed, not with triumph, never that. He was not a warrior seeking spoils. He was a weaver, a sculptor, shaping the narrative with the gentlest of touches. He did not stop. One god raised a counterpoint. A hesitation, just a small one, but enough. Another followed. And another. And just like that, the battle dissolved, its teeth blunted, its rage reduced to embers too weak to burn. The gods left that day believing they had reached an agreement of their own accord, convinced that reason had prevailed, that the world had been kept from the brink by their own wisdom. None of them noticed the laughter lingering in the air. None of them saw Enki turn away, slipping back into the shadows of the Abzu, his work done. For now, the night was strangled in silence. No wind stirred. No insects called. The world held its breath. Ziusudra lay awake, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet his mind restless, pacing in the darkness behind his closed eyes. Something gnawed at him, something unseen, unheard, but felt. A weight pressing against his ribs, curling around his throat. A whisper, though no voice had spoken. And then, water. Not a drop. Not a stream. A wall. A monstrous tide roaring through his skull, crashing over the landscape of his thoughts. He gasped, sitting upright, his skin slick with cold sweat. The room around him was undisturbed, yet his breath came shallow, desperate, as if he had already drowned. Then, the voice. Soft, like the rippling of water against the banks of the Abzu. But beneath it, an urgency, a sorrow deeper than the endless abyss. Ziusudra. His name, shaped in tones that did not belong to mortal tongues. He turned his head, slowly, terrified of what he might see. And there, just beyond the woven mat of his sleeping quarters, where shadow met light, stood the god. Enki. His form flickered, neither fully flesh nor holy spirit. A being of water and wisdom, of life and destruction. His eyes were endless, reflecting stars that did not belong to this sky. He stepped forward, though the ground did not tremble beneath him. The flood is coming. Ziusudra's heart clenched. He had not spoken, had not asked, yet the god had answered. The flood. The word carried weight, an echo of something vast, something merciless. Not rain, not a rising of the river, but a reckoning. The gods have spoken, Enki continued, his voice quiet, edged with something that might have been grief. They have judged the world unworthy. They will sweep it clean. Ziusudra could not breathe. He saw it. Not with his waking eyes, but in the space Enki had opened within his mind. The sky splitting apart. The land devoured. The screams of his people swallowed by the endless tide. He clutched at his chest, struggling to hold himself together. No, he rasped. No, they cannot. They can. Enki's expression did not change. And they will. 1,000 thoughts crashed over Ziusudra at once. His wife. His children. The streets of the city where he had walked, where he had built, where he had lived. All of it, gone. Erased. As if it had never been. No, he whispered again, but it was useless. The gods had already chosen. The flood had already begun. And yet, Enki stepped closer, his presence wrapping around Ziusudra like the hush before a storm. I cannot stop it. The words nearly crushed him. But you can survive. A single ember in the drowning dark. A thread in the unraveling weave of fate. Ziusudra clung to it. How? His voice was raw, barely more than breath. And Enki, the trickster, the wise one, the defier of divine wrath, he gave his answer. Not with words alone, but with visions. The shape of the vessel. The wood to be chosen. The exacting hands needed to build something that could defy the gods themselves. A lifeline against the wrath of the heavens. Ziusudra listened. He memorized every instruction, every warning. And when Enki faded, his form dissolving back into the night, the silence did not return. Because now, he could hear it. Far, far away, beyond the mountains, beyond the sky, the first raindrop. The air in the great hall of the gods was thick, stagnant, suffocating, brimming with an unseen weight. Silence hung like a blade, poised above the throats of those gathered. No one spoke. No one dared. The world below them pulsed with life, ignorant of what was about to be decided. Then, Enlil rose. His presence was a storm contained within flesh, his breath the hot wind before devastation, his gaze the crackling sky before the world was split apart. The very stones beneath his feet seemed to shrink from him. And when he spoke, his voice did not echo, it devoured. They are an abomination. The words were simple, yet they sent ripples through the council, turning unease into something sharper, something deadly. The other gods shifted, their luminous forms flickering. Some looked away. Some tightened their hands into fists. Enlil did not move. They were given life, he continued, his voice slow, heavy with contempt. They were given breath. They were given the earth beneath their feet, the sky above their heads. And yet, they defile it. They defile us. The gods listened, though the weight of his fury was unbearable. They are noisy. They are lawless. They multiply without restraint, crawling across the lands like vermin. They shout to the heavens with their greed, their gluttony, their endless hungers. They tear at the balance. His hands clenched, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to collapse inward. The wind that whispered through the chamber ceased. The light dimmed. The world stilled. They must be undone. The sentence fell like a hammer, and the hall of the gods shuddered. For a long moment, no one spoke. And then, a voice, softer but no less powerful. Enki. They are not beyond redemption. The word slithered through the tension, uncoiling in the space between wrath and reason. He stood at the edge of the council, the shifting water of his form shimmering with something unreadable. His eyes, dark and knowing, did not waver. Enlil turned to him, slow, deliberate. The air between them crackled. You defend them? A single question, yet beneath it lay 1,000 accusations. A warning. A threat. Enki's gaze did not falter. I remind you of what we created. They were given gifts, Enlil snapped. They spat upon them. They were given hunger, Enki countered. And so they eat. They were given passion. And so they love. They were given hands. And so they build. They destroy. They live. The words hung between them, trembling in the balance. And then, Enlil took a step forward. His rage was no longer contained. It surged, raw and unchained, wrapping around his form like fire, licking at the edges of the world itself. The sky above the earth darkened. The winds howled, screaming their terror. You would let them continue? His voice struck like lightning. You would let them infest the land until nothing remains but filth and ruin. Enki did not blink. Not all are corrupt. Enlil's laughter was bitter, a sound like the earth cracking apart. There is no redemption for them. There is no mercy. His hand rose. And the decision was made. A command, woven into the very fabric of existence. The sky would open. The waters would rise. The world would be drowned. And below, the humans, unaware, unwarned, lived their final days in ignorance. The night bled silence. Thick. Crushing. A silence so absolute that even the stars seemed to hold their breath, their distant light flickering like dying embers in the void. The gods had spoken. The flood was coming. Enki stood alone, his form woven from the waters themselves, a god of the abyss, of secrets, of things that move unseen beneath the surface. He should not have been afraid. And yet, something gnawed at him, something raw, something ancient. Humanity. He had shaped them with his own hands, molded them from the clay, breathed life into their fragile bodies. He had watched them stumble, watched them grow. He had given them fire, knowledge, the me, fragments of divine power, so they would not be empty shells beneath the sky. And now, they would be erased. Their bodies swallowed by the endless waters. Their voices lost, never to reach the heavens again. Enlil's decree was absolute. No one would warn them. No one would save them. And yet, a whisper. A ripple in the stillness. The waters around Enki trembled, drawn to something unspoken, something forbidden. He could not go against the gods. But he was the god of wisdom, of cunning. And wisdom found a way. His lips barely moved. Ziusudra. The name was spoken into nothingness, a word that should not have been uttered, a word that could mean his undoing. A human. A man. A single fragile being among thousands. But Enki knew. He had always known. Some were worth saving. Some carried the fire inside them, a light that even the gods could not snuff out. And so, he whispered again. Not to Ziusudra himself, no. Enki was bound, shackled by the divine decree. But the reeds listened. The wind carried the message, slipping through the cracks of the night, slithering into the man's dreams like a serpent coiled around his ear. The warning did not come as words. It came as a shudder in his bones. As the roar of waves before they even formed. As the weight of the sky pressing against his chest. And when Ziusudra woke, he knew. He knew without knowing how. The flood was coming. His hands trembled as he touched the earth, as if feeling it for the last time. He did not ask why. He did not question. He only obeyed the voice that had no voice, the whisper that had no mouth. His body moved before his mind could grasp the enormity of it. He cut the wood. He shaped it. He bled into it. And the great vessel took form beneath his hands. The gods watched. Enlil watched. But Enki was the trickster, the wise one, the one who bent the laws of the cosmos without breaking them. And so he did not command. He did not warn. He merely let the reeds whisper, let the wind tell its tale. He did not save humanity, he simply did not let them be blind to their fate. And the sky grew heavier. The winds became restless. And somewhere in the distance, the sea began to rise. The sky had shattered. The gods had torn it apart with their fury, and now the flood roared beneath the broken heavens, a monstrous tide of vengeance, swallowing cities, fields, temples, everything that had once stood beneath the gaze of eternity. The waters did not rise. They devoured. Ziusudra clung to the wooden beams of the ark, his fingers numb, his breath stolen by the screams outside. Voices lost mid-cry. Faces swept away before his eyes could hold onto them. He had known this was coming. He had built this vessel, sealed it with his own hands, bled into its very bones. But nothing could prepare him for the horror of watching the world die. The rain struck like spears. Winds howled, primal, furious, as if the gods themselves were wailing. The ark groaned, its wooden ribs trembling under the weight of survival. Bodies had once walked on the land below, lives had been lived, prayers had been whispered into the dust. Now all of it was gone, buried beneath the relentless hunger of the flood. Ziusudra did not cry. He could not. There was no space for grief when survival itself was an act of defiance. A hand gripped his arm, his wife. Her eyes were dark with exhaustion, her lips parted in words she could not find. Around them, the others huddled, the last fragments of a world erased. Their silence was heavier than the waters crashing outside. Then, stillness. It did not come suddenly. It seeped in, like the hush before a beast strikes. The waves no longer clawed at the ark, the winds no longer screamed. The sky, broken and bleeding, had forgotten its rage. But the silence was not peace. It was the aftermath of destruction, a void where life had once existed. Ziusudra rose, his body stiff, his soul heavier than the ark itself. He stepped forward, toward the hatch, his heartbeat the only sound he could hear. He pushed it open. The world was gone. Water stretched in all directions, an endless grave marked only by the skeletal remains of what once stood proud. No mountains. No trees. No temples for the gods. Just silence and the ghosts of what had been. He did not speak. Words had no place here. Instead, he reached for the bird, a fragile thing in his hands, trembling but alive. He lifted it, whispered something against its feathers, something only the wind would ever know. Then, he let go. The bird did not hesitate. It rose, wings slicing through the emptiness, carrying with it the last prayer of humanity. The gods watched. Enlil's wrath had drained, leaving behind something colder than anger, something like regret, though he would never name it. He had wished for an end, but now he gazed upon the nothingness and found no triumph in it. And Enki, silent but knowing, stood beneath the unseen heavens, waiting. The bird did not return. And that was enough. The water remembers. It remembers the screams, the final prayers, the hands that reached toward empty skies. It remembers the silence that followed, the weight of the drowned pressing into its depths, their names swallowed by the abyss. It does not matter where, or when, or who, the flood has come before, and it will come again. The earth was whole once. Then the gods shattered it. In Sumer, the storm had raged without mercy, tearing through the land, unmaking civilization with a fury only the divine could wield. Ziusudra stood on his ark, watching the end unfold, his breath stolen by the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. In another time, another land, a man named Noah trembled as the rain began to fall. He had spoken the words, warned of the coming wrath, but no one had listened. Now, their voices would be silenced beneath the rising water, their laughter, their defiance, their denial, all washed away. He did not look back. The mountains of the world have cradled more than one survivor. Deucalion and Pyrrha clung to each other as their small boat rocked against the waves, their world reduced to nothing but the endless stretch of destruction. The gods had grown weary of mankind, tired of their wickedness, their endless noise. And so they had been erased. The heavens wept. The waters obeyed. Every story is different, but the flood is always the same. The gods conspire, the waters rise, the earth drowns. The Babylonians told of Utnapishtim, warned in secret of the coming end, whispering to the walls as he built his vessel. He did not sleep that night, nor the nights that followed. The wind screamed as the flood consumed the land, as the people cried out, their voices lost beneath the roar of divine judgment. The Mayan spoke of the world swallowed in darkness, of the great deluge that washed away the first people, those who had failed to honor the gods. The wooden men had no souls, no hearts, and so the sky let loose its wrath. The Hopi elders remembered. The flood came when the world lost balance, when the people forgot the ways of harmony, when their corruption grew too great. They were given a chance, a warning whispered on the wind. Those who listened found shelter. Those who ignored it were taken by the depths. The water does not forget. The flood is more than a punishment. It is a test, a cleansing, a reckoning. It does not matter what name the gods wear, nor what tongues speak their warnings. The story is written in the bones of the earth, carved into the memory of mankind. And always, there is one who survives. One who listens when others scoff. One who builds while others waste their final hours in ignorance. One who watches the world die and steps into the silence that follows. The flood does not care for names. But the survivors do. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the smoke curling like restless spirits above the temple steps. The river murmured low, carrying whispers of things unseen, secrets older than the stone beneath their feet. In the great city of Eridu, where the gods once walked among men, Enki stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. His eyes, dark as the void before creation, flickered with something ancient, something dangerous. The gods had spoken. Humanity needed order. A ruler. A king. The world before kingship was chaos. The cities festered, leaderless, crumbling under the weight of their own ambition. Tribes warred like starving dogs, their hands stained red with brothers' blood, their voices raised in futile prayers to gods who had grown tired of their endless cries. There was no justice, no balance, only the sharp edge of a blade and the hunger of the strong devouring the weak. Enki had seen enough. He moved through the temple halls, his footsteps silent, his presence a force that bent the air around him. The decision had been made, but it was his hands that would shape it, his voice that would whisper the first decree of kingship into the bones of the earth. He would not allow this world to rot beneath its own failures. He would tear civilization from the chaos, carve it from the formless void like the first gods had carved existence from nothing. The heavens churned above, restless. The divine assembly had spoken, and Enlil's voice had thundered, unyielding, final. Kingship shall descend from the heavens. Enki had not argued. Not in words. He had smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of knowledge too vast for any to grasp. Enlil wanted control. He wanted a king to be a hammer, a weapon, a force that bent men's backs and silenced their tongues. But Enki had his own vision, and his was not one of chains. Power could not be given to one who did not understand the weight of it. A king could not be a tyrant, nor a puppet of the gods, mindless in his obedience. No, the king would be something else. Something greater. Enki would make certain of it. In the dead of night, he walked to the waters, where the sacred fish swam, where the current carried the wisdom of the deep. He reached into the blackness, fingers tracing patterns in the rippling surface, speaking words that had never been spoken before. The river stilled. The stars above flickered, waiting. And the first king was named. His name was etched into clay, pressed into the earth like a binding spell. His blood was mixed with water, a promise to the land, a contract between man and God. He was not born of lineage, nor chosen by blood. He was chosen by something greater, by wisdom, by fate, by Enki's own hand. The city walls rose, brick by brick, each stone carrying the weight of this new order. The people gathered, eyes wide with something they had never known before, hope. The first laws were spoken, not with cruelty, but with the precision of a craftsman shaping the world anew. A king was not merely a ruler. He was the heart of the city, the bearer of justice, the shield against the chaos that lurked beyond the gates. He would be taught the mysteries, the laws written in the hidden places of the gods. He would not be a slave to the divine, nor a tyrant to his people. He would stand between them, a bridge between the heavens and the earth. But the gods do not give power freely. The storm came first. Enlil, relentless, unyielding, tested the foundation of kingship with fire and flood, with the hunger of the desert winds and the wrath of the storm. The people trembled, voices raised in panic. They had followed Enki's wisdom, built the city as he commanded, crowned the king in the name of balance, but the sky itself had turned against them. Enki watched, silent. He did not intervene. A king who could not withstand the storm was no king at all. The rain lashed against the temple steps, the river swelling with the force of the heavens' rage. The new king stood upon the walls, his hands clenched, his body unmoving as the world screamed around him. He did not kneel. He did not run. He faced the gods as an equal, as one who had been chosen not by birthright, but by will. And the storm passed. The waters receded. The walls held. The city stood. The gods watched. They did not speak, but the silence was enough. Kingship had been tested. And it had endured. From that moment, it was no longer a gift, it was a right, earned in fire, in wisdom, in defiance. Enki had shaped it in his own image, twisting fate in his favor, ensuring that no king would ever rule by fear alone. In the years that followed, kings rose and fell. Some honored Enki's vision. Others forgot. Some drowned in their own arrogance, swallowed by the same chaos their rule had once tamed. The gods watched, patient. But the foundation had been set. The first stone had been laid. And Enki, ever smiling, watched from the waters. The reed scratched against the clay, slow, deliberate, carving something that had never existed before. The scribe's hands trembled, his breath shallow, as if he knew that what he was doing was no simple act, no fleeting task. It was creation itself. A whisper against the silence of the void. A defiance against the forgetting. The night outside was thick, endless, pressing against the world like an unseen weight. The fires in the temple flickered, their glow barely holding back the darkness. And Enki watched. He stood at the water's edge, his fingers grazing the current, his gaze distant. He had seen the world before knowledge, before the word was bound to the earth. He had watched men struggle to hold on to meaning, to keep the past from slipping through their fingers like sand. He had seen their voices rise and vanish, their deeds lost to time, their memories swallowed by the void that cared for nothing, remembered nothing. It was unacceptable. A world without words was a world without permanence. A world that could be shaped and reshaped by the whims of the strong, erased with the passing of a single breath. It was chaos. And Enki, the master of wisdom, would not allow it. The gods had not given this to man. They had not deemed it necessary. To them, knowledge was a thing to be hoarded, kept locked behind divine lips, shared only in whispers, in riddles, in fleeting glimpses of understanding. But Enki had always been different. He had always known that knowledge was meant to be given. And so he moved, unseen, a ripple in the night, a shadow in the firelight. The first scribe knelt before the clay, the stylus clutched in his shaking hands, and Enki's presence filled the space around him like an unseen tide. The man did not know why he wrote, only that he must. That the symbols flowing from his hands were more than scratches, more than marks. They were something sacred. Something eternal. The first word was formed. The air shifted. The gods stirred. Somewhere, far beyond mortal sight, they felt the tremor in the fabric of existence. Something had changed. Something irreversible had begun. And Enlil, the great ruler of the heavens, felt the weight of it like a coming storm. Enki, he spoke, his voice like thunder rolling across the void. "What have you done?" Enki did not answer. Not in words. Instead, the clay tablets multiplied. The scribes gathered, their hands moving faster, their symbols flowing like the waters of the great rivers. History was no longer spoken and forgotten. It was carved, solid, unyielding, defying time itself. The deeds of kings, the songs of the poets, the prayers of the faithful, they were bound to the earth now, impossible to erase. The gods could feel it. Power shifting. Mankind was no longer at the mercy of forgetting. No longer could the past be twisted by those who wished to shape it to their will. No longer could wisdom be lost with the passing of elders, with the death of those who carried it only in their minds. Knowledge had become immortal. And Enki had made it so. The scribes wrote on, their hands cramping, their eyes burning with exhaustion, but they did not stop. They could not stop. The words pulsed through them, a force beyond their understanding, a hunger they did not know they possessed until they had been given the means to satisfy it. And Enki smiled. Because this was more than writing. More than marks on clay. This was power. True power. Not the power of swords or walls or laws, but the power to remember. The power to pass wisdom through generations untouched by time. The power to preserve what the gods themselves might wish forgotten. This was a gift. But it was also a warning. Because knowledge, once given, could not be taken back. And somewhere in the dark corners of existence, the gods watched with uneasy eyes, realizing, too late, that Enki had done what he always did. He had changed the world. The boy's body convulsed. His skin burned with a fever that seemed to crawl beneath his flesh, whispering madness into his bones. His mother knelt beside him, pressing cool hands against his slick forehead, her breath a frantic prayer to gods who had yet to answer. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, thick and unmoving, watching, waiting. The air smelled of sickness, stagnant, sour, a promise of death. Outside, the waters of the sacred river lapped against the banks, gentle, steady, untouched by the chaos within the walls of the dying child's home. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The hush of silk robes brushing against the stone floor. A presence that sent the shadows retreating, curling into themselves, hissing without sound. The priest-physician stood at the threshold, his hand stained with the remnants of other battles against the unseen forces that wormed their way into mortal flesh. He carried no sword, no shield, no weapon of war. Only a bowl of water drawn from the holy depths and words older than sickness itself. Words taught by Enki, the wise, the healer, the keeper of knowledge no man should wield but must. He knelt beside the boy. The fever pulsed, alive, a thing that should not be. It twisted inside the child, ancient and cruel, something born from the filth of the world, from the spaces where the gods did not tread. It did not fear men. But it feared Enki. The priest dipped his fingers into the water. He traced symbols onto the boy's burning skin, marks of protection, of power. His voice rose in a low chant, rhythmic, relentless, weaving an invisible net around the sickness, forcing it to hear him, to know it was seen, it was named, it was not invincible. The room tightened. The air thickened. The fever fought. But Enki had gifted man more than words, more than the ability to remember. He had given them the tools to fight the things they could not see. He had whispered into the ears of the first healers, taught them the language of herbs, the weight of the body's balance, the paths illness carved through blood and breath. He had shown them that sickness was not a curse, but a force, one that could be bent, broken, banished. The mother wept as the boy's shaking slowed, his breaths evening out. The fever had not gone, not yet, but it had lost its grip. The priest's chant faded, his fingers trailing over the boy's skin one last time before he sat back, the weight of the battle pressing against his ribs. He had done all he could. The rest was left to time, to the strength of the child's own body, to Enki's will. Far beyond the mortal world, beneath the foundations of the earth, the god himself stood by the waters of the Abzu, his domain, his sanctuary. He felt the echoes of the struggle, the pull of sickness, the push of healing. He had felt it 1,000 times, 10,000, and he would feel it for as long as mortals walked the land. Because sickness would never cease. It would always return, shifting, changing, slipping through cracks in the world, burrowing into flesh and mind. And so would he. Every chant spoken over fevered skin. Every bitter herb crushed between careful fingers. Every hand that reached into the void to pull a soul back from the grasp of death. That was him. That was his gift. And no force, no darkness, no god above or below would ever take it away. The ground cracked, a vast mosaic of fractures stretching to the horizon. The sun hung above like a watchful god, unrelenting, pitiless, its fire licking at the brittle earth. The river was receding. Again. The people stood at its edge, bare feet pressing into the dust, watching, waiting. Silence. A silence that carried a weight, the kind that settled into bones and refused to leave. The crops had already begun to wither. Green had turned to brown. Stalks of barley curled in on themselves, their husks brittle, breaking at the slightest touch. The earth was dying. It always did. And the people? They could do nothing but beg. So they did. Priests, their faces drawn with hunger, stood before the sacred temple. Their voices, raw with desperation, rose into the scorching air, a chant, a plea, a demand. They spoke his name, Enki. Enki of the Abzu, Enki of the sweet waters, Enki who held the power to save or to abandon. The people had not forgotten. They could not. It was his waters that had once given them life. It was his hand that had carved pathways through the barren earth, calling the rivers to heal, commanding them to feed the land instead of defying it. But now, the water was vanishing, the river shrinking into a thin ribbon of despair. Without it, they were nothing. Then, a shift. A wind that did not belong to the desert swept through the land, curling around the temple steps, sinking into the dust. The people inhaled sharply, tasting something on the air, something cool, something ancient, something that should not have been there. The earth shuddered beneath them. Not an earthquake. A breath. A pulse. The waters answered. From beneath the land, from the places hidden from mortal eyes, the sacred depth stirred. The Abzu, Enki's domain, trembled as its master moved. And then, flooding. Not destruction, not a wrathful surge meant to drown the disobedient, but life, pouring from the ground as if the veins of the world had been split open to feed the dying land. The river swelled. Its banks, once shrunken, now stretched with new strength, curling through the barren fields, licking at the roots of starving crops. The canals, once empty scars upon the landscape, filled with water so clear it mirrored the sky. The land drank greedily, its thirst endless, its hunger insatiable. The people, breathless, fell to their knees, their fingers sinking into the dampened soil, pressing against the miracle beneath them. Gratitude came in waves, a soundless sob from 1,000 voices. Enki had answered. He always did. But his gift was not just water. It was knowledge. It was the understanding that rivers could be tamed, that water was not merely something to beg for, to await with blind faith, it was something to be commanded. It was something to shape. The first canals had not appeared by chance. They had been drawn into the earth by hands guided by a wisdom that did not belong to man alone. Enki had whispered to the first engineers, showing them how to bend the river's will without breaking it, how to weave waterways like a net, trapping life where once there was only death. And they had listened. They dug channels, careful, precise, leading water where it had never dared to flow before. They shaped the land to obey them, forcing it to yield, to produce, to sustain. Civilization was not born from stone, nor from fire, nor from conquest. It was born from this. From water that knew its place. From land that had been taught to serve. The harvests returned, golden and heavy, bending under their own abundance. The people no longer stood at the river's edge with empty hands, waiting for mercy. They had become the masters of the earth, the keepers of the flood. And Enki watched. Not as a tyrant, nor as an absent god who demanded offerings without granting favor. He watched as a father watches his children take their first steps, as a creator sees his work completed not through force, but through wisdom passed down. The land thrived. The cities grew. The gods above may have ruled the heavens, but here, in the heart of the world, it was Enki's gift that reigned. The chisel struck stone. A single sound, sharp and final, echoing through the half-built temple. Sweat dripped from the artisan's brow, tracing lines of dust down his face. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he carved. Every stroke was a prayer. Every curve of cuneiform a whisper of knowledge that must never be lost. The air smelled of clay and fire. Kilns blazed, devouring mud bricks and breathing them back into existence, hardened and eternal. Scribes hunched over damp tablets, pressing reeds into their surfaces, their fingers ghosting over symbols that carried the weight of gods. The first words ever written had not been meant for mortals alone. They had been messages for eternity, conversations between men and divinity, inked into the bones of civilization. Enki watched. Not from above, not in the distant, untouchable heavens where other gods sat, waiting for their tributes. He was here, in the hands of the builders, in the ink of the scribes, in the breath of the priest-kings who spoke the laws that would shape empires. His wisdom was not given as a command, nor forced upon those unworthy. It was passed down like a flame, carried by those who understood that power was nothing without knowledge, and knowledge was nothing if left unshared. The priest-kings stood atop their ziggurats, gazing over the land, over the canals that carved life into the dust, over the fields that bowed heavy with the weight of grain. They were not just rulers. They were vessels. They did not merely wield authority, they bore the responsibility of Enki's greatest gift, understanding. They knew that laws could not be dictated by whims. They had to be carved into stone, unyielding, unbreakable, fair. They did not seek war for the sake of conquest. They sought balance, order, harmony. And when corruption threatened to creep into their courts, when greed whispered in the ears of lesser men, they called upon Enki. Not for vengeance. For clarity. For wisdom sharper than any blade. The scholars sat in the dim glow of oil lamps, eyes scanning endless lines of script, mouths moving in silent recitation. Knowledge had to be held, memorized, passed on with the precision of the stars above. One mistake could twist meaning, turn a cure into a poison, a law into an injustice. They studied the heavens, mapping constellations as though charting the thoughts of the gods. They recorded floods and harvests, searching for the hidden patterns within time itself. They spoke languages that only the initiated could understand, and yet their work was meant for all who would listen. And the artisans, those whose hands did not simply shape stone but mold eternity. Their walls did not merely stand, they told stories. Their statues did not simply exist, they breathed. In the halls of temples, they carved Enki's wisdom into clay, into gold, into the very foundation of the cities that stood as proof of his guidance. They understood that beauty was not excess. It was memory, captured in form, meant to last beyond flesh, beyond generations. The city pulsed with life, but beneath the surface, beneath the noise of markets and the calls of merchants, there was something more. A current, unseen yet felt, running through its veins like the sacred waters of the Abzu. It was Enki's wisdom, carried by those who did not just seek to rule, to build, to create, but to understand. And so, the builders of civilization continued their work. The chisel struck stone. The reeds pressed into clay. The lamps burned into the night. And Enki watched, not as a distant god, but as the whisper in their hands, in their minds, in the unbreakable will of those who carried his gift. The old gods watched in silence. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of a changing world. The temples that once echoed with prayers to Enki, the wise and eternal, now bore a different name. Fires still burned on the altars, but they did not call to him. The chants rose, desperate and hungry, but they praised another. Marduk. His name spread like fire through the cities, through the tongues of priests who once bowed before Enki's wisdom. The walls of Babylon stretched toward the heavens, a monument not to the god who had shaped rivers, guided kings, and whispered knowledge into the ears of mortals, but to one who now stood in his place. The waters that once flowed freely from the Abzu, that had cradled creation itself, now seemed distant, buried beneath the rising power of a new god. There was a time when Enki's voice had shaped the world, when his hands had lifted mankind from the dust and given them words, law, life itself. But the world does not remember forever. Power shifts like sand in the wind, and mortals are quick to forget. The scribes rewrote the stories. They took the deeds of Enki, the wisdom that shaped the first cities, and placed them in the hands of another. Marduk became the slayer of chaos, the architect of the world, the ruler of the heavens. They carved his name into the clay, pressing away the truth with every stroke of the reed. The myths bent, twisted, reformed, not by the gods, but by those who wielded words like weapons. In the great halls of Babylon, Enki's name was whispered, but never sung. He was still there, in the hidden places, in the spaces between the stones, in the echoes of ancient prayers that had not yet faded. But the altars no longer bore his mark. The priests no longer carried his wisdom in their eyes. Marduk had come with conquest, with the force of an empire behind him. He had not been born of the waters, nor had he shaped humanity with his own hands. But the scribes made it so. They wove him into the stories, stitched his name into the very fabric of existence until it was impossible to tell where one god ended and the other began. And so, the old god watched as his own stories were stolen, as his temples were claimed, as the world moved on without him. But the rivers still carried his name. The current still whispered his truths. And somewhere, beneath the weight of a rising empire, Enki remained. Silent. Waiting. The name was changing. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It began as a whisper, slipping between tongues like a serpent in the dust. Enki, lord of the Abzu, keeper of wisdom, the one who had shaped the first breath of civilization, his name, his essence, was shifting. The people still called to him, but their voices wavered. The sound of his name felt different. Stretched, reshaped, twisted by tongues that spoke a new language. Ea. It was spoken in the halls of Akkad, in the rising cities where the old Sumerian words were giving way to something harsher, something edged with conquest and power. The scribes pressed the new name into wet clay, and the change became real. Not just a name, but a transformation. A reshaping. As if the god himself were being carved anew, his identity slipping between the fingers of time. But gods do not forget who they are. They do not simply fade into another name without resistance. The waters of the Abzu trembled. The rivers swelled and receded, restless, uncertain. The sacred channels that once carried Enki's blessings to the fields, the lifeblood of cities, now felt foreign, unfamiliar. Was it still him? Was he still the same god? Or was something being stolen from him, piece by piece, syllable by syllable? The temple still burned with sacred flame. The priest still whispered invocations, still sought the wisdom that only he could give. But their words wavered. The old hymns did not sit right in their mouths. They called him Ea, and the air felt different. The weight of centuries pressed against the new name, and yet, they spoke it all the same. The Akkadians took what they wanted. They always had. Cities fell before them, their kings kneeling, their gods absorbed, swallowed whole into the new order. Sumer had given birth to civilization, but Akkad was remaking it, forging it into something unyielding, something made for empire. And so Enki did not disappear. He was too vast, too deeply woven into the bones of the world. But he was no longer quite himself. His name, his shape, his purpose, they all bent under the weight of the shifting world. The trickster god, the wise one, the keeper of the great waters, he remained. But now, he bore a name not entirely his own. Ea. And though the rivers still flowed, though the temples still stood, something was lost. Something slipped between the cracks of time, vanishing into the silence where old gods go when the world no longer speaks their true names. The ink had dried. The clay had hardened. The stories had changed. But Enki had not disappeared. His name had been buried under dust, his shrines left to crumble, his waters left to recede into the silence of forgotten prayers. But his whispers had not faded. They had only changed shape, slipping between tongues, between scrolls, between scriptures. He had been called many things, but he was never truly gone. The flood. The great, devouring flood. It was there, in the old hymns, carved in cuneiform long before the stories of Genesis. The god who warned of the rising waters, the one who whispered salvation into the ears of mortals, who told a man to build, to prepare, to survive, was it Enki? Was it Ea? Or had his voice been stolen, repurposed, reshaped? Ziusudra. Atrahasis. Noah. Different names. The same story. A man chosen. A warning given. A flood sent to cleanse the world. A god who defied the others to save humanity. But no one spoke his name anymore. The old gods did not die. They were devoured, absorbed, reborn under different names, different faiths, different tongues that still echoed the same ancient truths. the trickster who guided mankind, the serpent who gifted knowledge, the bringer of wisdom both forbidden and sacred. His presence bled through the lines of later faiths, but his name was stripped from them, cast aside like an empty husk. Eden. A paradise with a river splitting into four. The waters that gave life to the first man, the first woman. The knowledge they were forbidden to touch. The serpent that whispered to them, not in lies, but in truth. Not in malice, but in revelation. Was he there too? A god of wisdom, a god of creation, a god whose waters shaped the world and whose defiance reshaped it again. A god who had once stood among the pantheon of Sumer but now lingered in the shadows of other faiths, his face blurred, his name erased. The priests of Babylon had twisted him. The scribes of later empires had rewritten him. But his fingerprints were still there, pressed into the foundation of every great belief that rose from the lands where he once ruled. He had been Enki. He had been Ea. And even now, he was something more. The god's name was dust. For thousands of years, he lay buried beneath the weight of forgotten time, his voice lost in the shattered fragments of clay tablets, his power reduced to crumbling inscriptions no living eye had seen. His temples had fallen, his priests had turned to bones, his rivers had dried to silence. No one spoke of him anymore. And yet, he never left. His name waited beneath the earth, beneath the ruins of cities whose kings once trembled at his whispers. It waited in the libraries of forgotten scholars, in the locked cabinets of museums where stolen history slept beneath glass. It waited in coded cuneiform, in broken artifacts, in the pages of books no one had touched in centuries. And then, someone spoke it again. It started in the quiet, in the whispers of those who felt something missing, those who traced old symbols with trembling fingers, those who read the old words and felt the echo of something too vast to stay buried. A scholar in a dimly lit room, flipping through brittle pages. A mythologist staring at a carved name no one could quite translate. A seeker, an outsider, someone who didn't belong, but who understood. Enki. The name burned like an ember, unearthed from the suffocating dark. It spread like wildfire, leaping from pages to minds, from forgotten texts to fervent discussions, from obscurity to something terrifyingly alive. They saw him in the myths, hiding in plain sight. The trickster. The wise one. The savior of humanity. They saw his fingerprints on stories that had survived, his essence twisted but never erased, his wisdom lingering in faiths that never spoke his name. And they called for him again. The old texts were read, the old hymns sung, the ancient symbols drawn by hands that still trembled at their power. Forums filled with voices dissecting the fragments, scholars wrote papers that felt more like prayers, seekers whispered his name in the dark like a secret never meant to be lost. A god forgotten is not a god dead. He was never dead. Just waiting. Waiting beneath the ruins, beneath the flood of time, beneath the silence that had never truly been silent. And now, he rises again. The fire should not have been stolen. The water should not have been given. The gods do not gift freely. Their knowledge is a fortress, their power a clenched fist. They hoard wisdom as a miser hoards gold, locking it behind barriers of divinity, of fear, of punishment. And yet, again and again, someone breaks the rules. A hand reaches where it should not. A mind understands what was never meant to be understood. A whisper slips past the walls, curling like smoke into mortal ears. Enki. Prometheus. Names that echo in different tongues, across different lands, yet carry the same forbidden weight. The trickster, the savior, the one who defies the heavens not for himself but for those who kneel below. He walks between worlds, feet brushing divine marble and blood-soaked dust in the same breath. He laughs in the face of decree, bends law until it snaps. He suffers for it. Prometheus, bound to stone, his ribs torn open every day by an unyielding beak, his crime never forgiven, his torment never ending. Enki, bound not in chains, but in silence, his name twisted, his deeds claimed by others, his presence a ghost in stories that should have been his. The punishment is different, but the betrayal is the same. It is a pattern written into the bones of myth, into the bones of humanity itself. The trickster who gives. The god who rebels. The savior who is punished. Over and over, the cycle turns, as if the act itself cannot be undone. They call him many names. Enki, the god who defied fate to save mortals from the flood, whispering his warning through the walls of reed. The clever one, the keeper of knowledge, the one who taught humans how to shape clay into bricks, how to coax life from barren ground. The one who knew that wisdom was too powerful to be chained. Prometheus, the titan who climbed the heavens to steal the flame, his hands blackened by the fire he carried down to trembling men. The defier of Zeus, the one who saw them shivering in the dark and could not bear to look away. Loki, the deceiver, the shapeshifter, the laughing shadow who walks the edge of treachery and salvation. The bringer of chaos, but also of cunning. The breaker of rules, but also the breaker of stagnation. Ishu, the African trickster who twists paths, who opens doors that should have remained closed, who speaks in riddles yet leaves truth in his wake. Mercury, Hermes, the messenger, the boundary crosser, the one who slips between the cracks of order and mischief, always one step ahead, always carrying something the gods would rather keep to themselves. They are scattered across the world, across time, across belief, and yet, they are the same. They are the force that will not be caged. The wind that bends around the bars. The serpent that coils through the gaps. The mind that questions, that seeks, that disobeys. The world is not built for them. And yet, it needs them. The gods would have left humanity blind. Helpless. Crawling through the dirt with empty hands and empty minds, forever at the mercy of their distant whims. But someone always interferes. Someone always reaches into the heavens and takes what was never meant to be shared. Someone always suffers for it. And yet, the fire still burns. The water still flows. The knowledge still lingers. Because once the gift has been given, it cannot be undone. The air is thick with something unseen. Not fear. Not reverence. Something older. Something waiting. A single drop of water trembles on the stone. It hangs there, caught between motion and stillness, caught between the past and the present. Then, as if deciding, it falls. The sound it makes is small, almost insignificant. But it is enough. It sends ripples outward. It reminds the stone that it is not as solid as it believes itself to be. Somewhere, beneath layers of time, Enki stirs. His name was once spoken in whispers, in prayers, in songs woven through the reeds along the Euphrates. His temple stood mighty, filled with scholars tracing his wisdom into clay. His waters flowed freely, filling the hands of those who thirsted, filling the minds of those who sought understanding. But time is cruel, and men forget. They let his name sink beneath the tide, let his stories fade into dust, let his wisdom be swallowed by those who would claim it as their own. Yet something ancient never truly dies. It lingers in the spaces between words, in the questions that refuse to go unanswered, in the hands that still shape clay into form, in the minds that still seek knowledge not given, but earned. It lingers in those who rebel against blind authority, in those who question, in those who create. It lingers in you. Look around. The world is not as different as it pretends to be. The rulers still hoard power, still whisper among themselves in chambers of stone and steel. They still claim dominion over knowledge, still tell you what you may learn, what you may think, what you may believe. They build walls, invisible yet unbreakable, between those who hold wisdom and those who seek it. They say, "This is not for you." But Enki never listened. He reached past the boundaries, past the laws, past the silent, stifling weight of decree. He gave without permission. He knew that wisdom locked away is wisdom wasted. He knew that creation is defiance. That to shape, to learn, to question, is an act of rebellion. And rebellion is contagious. Look closer. They are waking up. The ones who still call his name, even if they do not yet realize it. The scholars who refuse to let history rot in forgotten tongues. The builders who shape the future from their own hands. The seekers who dare to drink from forbidden streams. The rebels who refuse to bow. And some remember him in name as well as spirit. They gather in quiet corners, in hidden spaces, where the echoes of old prayers still linger in the dust. They study the symbols carved into ancient stone, trace the words pressed into clay, searching for what was lost. They light candles, they pour water, they speak to him as their ancestors once did, not as a god above them, but as a guide beside them. Enki is not a god of empty worship. He does not demand kneeling, does not crave sacrifice. He does not need devotion carved into monuments or chanted in ritual tongues. He needs only action. To create. To question. To learn. That is his worship. That is his temple. Not walls of stone, but minds unshackled. Not offerings of blood, but hands shaping something new. Not silent obedience, but the daring to ask, why? The water drips again. The ripples spread. Listen. Can you hear him?